Cliff Richard never married. And for decades, fans wondered why he never settled down, especially with the one woman he seemed closest to, Olivia Newton-John. They toured together, performed together, even leaned on each other during heartbreaks. To the outside world, it looked like love. So why didn't it happen? Now, Cliff has finally said the quiet part out loud, about the timing, the silence, and the painful truth he kept to himself. And what he just admitted about Olivia left fans speechless. Before the world saw them as music legends, they were just two rising stars navigating the whirlwind of fame. And somehow, their paths collided in a way that felt almost inevitable. Cliff Richard was already a household name in Britain by the early 1970s, and Olivia Newton-John was quickly becoming Australia's golden girl with a voice that could melt the hardest heart. Their connection started in the world of music, but it didn't stay there for long. To most people, their friendship looked effortless. Cliff was older, more established. Olivia was glowing with fresh talent and quiet charm. But behind the scenes, it wasn't just professional admiration. It was something gentler, something more personal. And it didn't take long before people around them began to wonder if there was something deeper than friendship. There were long stretches of time spent working together, TV specials, concerts, charity performances. But it wasn't just the time on stage that told the real story. It was the comfort they had offstage. The kind of comfort that doesn't come from rehearsal. It comes from trust. And for Cliff, that trust mattered more than anything. He had always kept his private life closely guarded. Fame had its costs, and for someone like him, deeply religious, often scrutinized by the press, every personal choice could become tabloid fodder. Olivia, in contrast, had a softness to her that seemed to calm the noise. She didn't demand attention. She didn't chase headlines. She just showed up, and somehow, Cliff kept showing up right alongside her. Their bond grew stronger with each passing year. And though Cliff had been romantically linked to other women in the past, fans couldn't help but notice that there was something different about the way he looked at Olivia. They shared a quiet closeness. Never flashy, never loud, but unmistakable. Even when they were apart, their paths seemed to circle back to each other. During Olivia's rise to superstardom in the late 70s and early 80s, their connection never seemed to fade. They always found time for duets, reunions, collaborations. When Cliff was in Australia, Olivia made time. When Olivia was in London, Cliff was waiting. It wasn't hard to read between the lines. But as the years passed and neither of them ever married each other, the question lingered. Why? Was it timing? Distance? Or something unspoken between them that neither had the courage to confront? Cliff had always spoken about the pressures of his career, the expectations placed on him, and the complications of living in the spotlight. Olivia, too, had her share of personal battles, health scares, heartbreaks, and the challenges of being seen as an icon instead of just a woman. And yet, despite all the forces that might have pulled them apart, they never really did drift. That's what made their story so haunting. It wasn't a typical Hollywood flameout. There was no scandal, no public breakup, just silence. A long stretch of unanswered questions, missed chances, and what-ifs. And in recent years, it's become clear that for Cliff, those what-ifs never truly went away. He's always been reflective. But when it comes to Olivia, something shifts. His tone becomes quieter, the pauses longer. And that's what fans are picking up on now, how deeply he still carries the weight of what could have been. Every close relationship has a window, a moment where everything is hanging in the balance, where a single word, a single choice can change everything. And for Cliff Richard, that moment with Olivia Newton-John came quietly. No fanfare, no flashing lights, just a subtle shift in timing that, looking back, meant everything. It was the late 1970s, and both of their careers were reaching new heights. Olivia had exploded onto the international stage with a blend of innocence and star power that made her impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Cliff was entering a mature phase of his career, still beloved, still relevant, but aware that time was moving. And so was she. They had spent years growing close, sharing stages and green rooms, holidays and inside jokes. To friends who saw them up close, there was no question they were important to each other. But for Cliff, Something always held him back from pushing the friendship into something more. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like a deep hesitation, a belief that saying something out loud might ruin the very thing that made their bond so rare. There was a night in London, just the two of them, no cameras, no spotlight, when Cliff felt the tug to speak, to reach across the emotional line they'd been dancing on for years. He could have told her what she meant to him, that he thought about it often, that the idea of them as more than friends had never truly left his mind. But he didn't. Instead, he smiled, said something polite, and let the silence stretch between them. It wasn't just shyness. Cliff had always been deeply conflicted about relationships. His faith played a major role, as did the enormous expectations placed on him as a public figure. He carried the weight of being Cliff Richard everywhere he went, an icon who represented not just music, but morality. For someone raised in the church, torn between spiritual ideals and earthly longings, the idea of love wasn't simple. It was complicated, messy, risky, and with Olivia the stakes felt impossibly high, because she wasn't just another possible romance. She was the one who truly understood him, the one who never tried to change him, the one who had seen behind the curtain of his fame and still stayed. Cliff had other relationships, yes, but none ever seemed to carry the same quiet depth, the same comfort Olivia offered just by being there. And deep down, he must have known that if he crossed that line and it didn't work, he could lose her entirely. So he stayed silent. And then time moved on. Olivia found love elsewhere. She married, had a daughter, built a life. Cliff watched from a distance, supportive, friendly, but always outside the frame. He never inserted himself. He never interrupted her life with regrets. But regrets? He had them. That much has become clear. It's easy to think of missed love as something dramatic, a breakup, a fight, a betrayal. But sometimes the heartbreak isn't what did happen. It's what didn't. Cliff never betrayed Olivia. He never broke her heart. But in some small, silent way, he let her go. And the pain of that kind of silence doesn't fade easily. Because the truth is, he had his moment, and he let it pass. As time marched on, Cliff Richard and Olivia Newton-John drifted into different orbits, physically, emotionally, and professionally. Olivia's career in the US soared. Her role in Grease transformed her from a singer into a global icon, and she fully stepped into that spotlight, bright and effortless. Cliff, meanwhile, remained rooted in the UK, where his career continued steadily but with a quieter, more grounded rhythm. They didn't see each other as often. Their public appearances together became rare. But something remarkable happened. The connection didn't fade. It changed. It deepened. Because even when years went by without a photo or performance, their bond was never in question. Cliff would speak about Olivia with a warmth that was unmistakable. And when their paths did cross, at concerts, charity events, or backstage reunions, there was no awkwardness. No sense of lost love or burned bridges. Just familiarity, trust, the kind of trust that doesn't vanish with time. For many fans, their enduring closeness only made the mystery more powerful. Why hadn't they married? Why hadn't they even tried? Some speculated that they'd made a private pact to remain friends and nothing more. Others believed Cliff had simply waited too long, and by the time he was ready, Olivia had moved on. But the truth was likely quieter than any theory. It was a matter of timing, of hesitations, of one small decision that sent them down parallel tracks instead of one shared path. And still, Cliff kept her close. He followed her life from a distance, celebrated her highs, stood by during her lows. When Olivia went through her first divorce, he didn't swoop in. When she battled health issues, he didn't make it about himself. He respected her boundaries. He honored her life, but that didn't mean he stopped feeling the weight of what they could have been. In interviews, Cliff became more reflective as the years went on. He talked more openly about loneliness, about the challenges of aging without a partner. And while he never named names, it was hard to miss the undercurrent. That there had been someone who made him think, just once, maybe, and that maybe had never gone away. Olivia, too, seemed to carry a tenderness toward Cliff that outlasted romance. She never dismissed him, never denied how close they were. There was a kind of reverence between them, the kind that only grows when two people have shared something they never had to label. Some fans believed they stayed friends because they were afraid of ruining it. Others felt it was simply more profound than a traditional love story. After all, Cliff had been one of the few people Olivia trusted during the most chaotic years of her fame. He was the safe harbor, uncomplicated, gentle, always constant. And in a world where so many relationships crumble under the pressure of fame, theirs was a quiet miracle. But Cliff never forgot. That much is certain. The regret he's spoken of in later years isn't bitter. It isn't dramatic. It's more like a quiet ache that never healed. A recognition that while he made the right choices for the life he believed he had to live, some part of him still wonders what might have happened if he'd taken the risk. And when Olivia's health struggles returned in her final years, that ache sharpened. Suddenly, time wasn't endless anymore. The window that had once closed quietly now felt sealed shut forever. But still, their story wasn't over, because Cliff held onto something, a memory, promise, and eventually, when the world lost Olivia, he would finally let the truth surface. As Olivia Newton-John entered the final chapter of her life, there was a calmness to her that struck people. She had faced more than her share of challenges, public ones, private ones, and yet, she met them with grace that felt almost otherworldly. Through her illness, she remained optimistic, compassionate, and focused on spreading light. And Cliff Richard was watching. He wasn't in the tabloids. He wasn't front and center. But he was there, quietly, steadily, just as he had always been. By this time, decades had passed since that unspoken moment, the one where he could have said what he truly felt. And now, there was no longer time to rewrite history. Olivia was slipping away, and for Cliff, that realization landed hard. He had always been careful with his public image. But this was different. This wasn't about music or reputation. This was about someone who had meant more to him than almost anyone else. And when she passed, something shifted. For the first time in years, Cliff Richard allowed his guard to drop, if only slightly. He became more reflective, more open. He didn't need to say Olivia was the love of his life. He didn't need to declare anything dramatic. But the pain on his face told the story clearly. Fans noticed the way he spoke about her after her passing. There was no bitterness, just sorrow. A kind of sorrow that can only come from something left unsaid for too long. In those quiet admissions, the kind that didn't make headlines, but made listeners stop and feel, Cliff revealed that he had always held Olivia in a special place in his heart. Not just as a friend, not just as a colleague, but as something more, something deeper, something he had never fully allowed himself to explore. He had reasons, faith, responsibility, timing. The past was full of complicated choices, but the present offered no protection from regret. And while Cliff didn't offer any dramatic confessions, the way he looked back made it clear that he wished he had done something differently, that he had said something sooner, that he had taken the risk. Because when Olivia died, so did the last possibility of that story ever having a new chapter. The door closed, and this time it stayed closed. For someone like Cliff, who had spent his life crafting a legacy of composure and restraint, it was a rare moment of emotional honesty. Not loud, not theatrical, just quietly devastating. There were tributes, of course, public remembrances, celebrations of Olivia's kindness, talent, and strength. But behind all that was something more personal. Cliff had lost not just a friend, but a part of his past that never really healed. He had carried that quiet regret for decades. But now the world knew, maybe not the full story, but enough to understand that what they had wasn't ordinary. It wasn't simply a friendship. It was a love that never quite made it to the surface, but never died either. And for Cliff, that realization didn't bring peace. It brought a kind of ache that lingers. Not the kind you shout from the rooftops, but the kind you carry in silence. Because you know it's yours alone. He had his reasons. He lived his life the way he thought he should. But in the end, when it came to Olivia, he couldn't deny the truth any longer. He never stopped caring. He never truly let her go. And when he finally spoke from the heart, it wasn't a performance. It was the truth, and it left fans shattered. There are stories that fade with time. This isn't one of them. Richard and Olivia Newton-John didn't need to hold hands on red carpets or declare their feelings in front of cameras to leave an impact. What they had was quieter, more restrained, and somehow more haunting because of it. A connection that never crossed the line into romance, but always danced right up to the edge. And maybe that's why it still lingers in the hearts of so many fans. People don't just remember the duets or the stage appearances or the interviews. They remember the feeling, that undeniable closeness. The way Cliff looked at her. The way Olivia lit up when he walked into a room. The sense that something deeper was always just beneath the surface, waiting, but never quite arriving. That sense of unfinished business, of a love story left untold, has become part of their legacy. And when Cliff finally acknowledged, even gently, that he still carries regret, it hit people like a wave. Because we've all known what it's like to wonder what if, to look back and realize that timing, fear, or silence kept us from speaking when it mattered most. And Cliff's story, as polished and composed as it once seemed, now felt achingly human. He wasn't just a pop star anymore. He was a man who had loved and stayed silent, and lost the chance to ever go back. What makes it all the more powerful is that Olivia never needed a grand gesture. She was never the kind of woman who demanded attention or made others prove themselves. She gave grace freely, and maybe that's what made the whole thing so tragic. Cliff never had to earn her affection. He already had it. All he had to do was reach out. But he didn't, and now the moment is gone. For fans, the realization has stirred deep emotions. Comment sections under old videos are filled with people expressing heartbreak, not just for Olivia's passing, but for the love that never got its chance. Some are angry, some are wistful, but nearly everyone agrees. They were soulmates, whether they admitted it or not. And that's the part that lingers. Not a scandal, not a betrayal, but something purer and therefore more painful. Even now, Cliff remains protective of her memory. He speaks of her with a softness that time hasn't worn down. And while he may never tell the whole story, he's said just enough for the world to understand. She mattered. She mattered in a way that still keeps him up at night. Their story has become something larger than the two of them. It's a reflection of missed chances, of love unspoken, of the cost of playing it safe. And for Cliff, who built his life on responsibility and restraint, the price of silence is something he now carries in his voice, his eyes, and his carefully chosen words. In the end, it wasn't the lack of love that broke fans' hearts. It was the abundance of it, left unrealized. The glances that said more than words. The timing that never aligned. The final goodbye that came too soon. And the quiet confession years too late. It was his own fault. In a world obsessed with declarations and headlines, Richard and Olivia Newton-John's story stands apart. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. No public romance. No confessions. No fairy tale ending. And yet, their bond became one of the most talked about love stories in music history. Not because it was fulfilled, but because it wasn't. For Cliff, the decision not to pursue Olivia may have felt like the right one at the time. Maybe it spared them the risks of failure. Maybe it protected the friendship they cherished. But the cost, revealed only in hindsight, was a lifetime of wondering what might have been. And for fans, that's what makes it unforgettable. It's not just about two stars who shared a stage. It's about the ache of timing, the fragility of silence, and the regret that comes from choosing safety over vulnerability. Olivia is gone now, but her presence in Cliff's life never really left. And now that he's opened the door, even slightly, fans are seeing the story behind the music. The one he kept tucked away quietly for decades. He didn't lose her to scandal or heartbreak. He lost her to time. And now all that's left is the memory, and the truth he was too afraid to say. Sometimes the most powerful love stories aren't the ones that end in marriage or a kiss. Sometimes they're the ones that stay unfinished. And Richard's story with Olivia Newton-John? That's the kind that leaves a mark forever. For more emotional stories, check out this video.